Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for April 13th, 2022. Today I'm going to talk about the lie that the world is divided into two camps, the democracies versus the autocracies. There are two camps, and these are sharpening, but the division is between those who rely on parasitical looting, namely the US, the UK, and the European Union, and intimidate poorer countries to support them, as opposed to those who are committed to economic development and the sovereign protection of their own people. Now, there's a desperation to portray unanimity, and the US and the UK are on a full-fledged offensive against those countries which refuse to submit to their idea of a rules-based order and are not going along with the condemnation of Russia. Now, who are the countries that are refusing to go along with them? Well, some have long-term ties to Russia. Others are members of the former non-aligned nations, which don't want to be part of any political bloc, east or west, north or south. Many of them are nations that have come from a colonial background, which unfortunately have experienced the pleasure of being looted by those largely European countries. And they understand the blackmail power of the financial oligarchy and are beginning to look to see if the Russia-China alliance, along with the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the Eurasian Economic Union, offer an alternative to submission to the International Monetary Fund and the military power of the US and NATO. Now let's take one case study of how desperate this attempt is to portray unanimity, and that's the targeting of India. Just in the last couple of days, there's been a stream of US visitors to India to engage in tough talk with the Indian government. The Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, told the Congress at the end of last week, quote, "We would prefer that India move from their long-term history of non-alignment G77 partnership with Russia," unquote. Well, what's the benefit for India in that? Well, there were meetings over the weekend of the diplomatic and defense ministers from both countries discussing the situation. And India did not budge from their non-aligned position, their unwillingness to condemn Russia. Then Biden conducted a call with Prime Minister Modi. This was described in diplomatic talk as candid and very candid, which might mean there was a shouting match provided Biden could raise his voice. Psaki, the press secretary, not known for honesty, said that Biden, quote, conveyed, unquote, to Modi, quote, "It is not in India's interest," unquote, to increase imports of Russian energy and other commodities, and said the US would help them diversify their energy imports. Now, how is it that the Biden administration knows better than Modi's administration what's in India's interests? Well, that's because they're defining India's interests as being synonymous with that of the rules-based order, which means submitting to the global reset under the influence of London and Wall Street banks. Now, to make clear what they mean when they say they would help you diversify the energy imports, Blinken basically said India should give up fossil fuels. He said that India is the third largest consumer of energy. Well, it's the second largest population in the world. Why should that be surprising? And India relies heavily on coal. They want more gas from Russia, and they're developing nuclear power, none of which are acceptable under COP26. And Blinken said India must fulfill the climate goals of COP26, which the Indians said they're reluctant to do for obvious reasons. Now then the ace in the hole came out, the warning that Russia and China are in an alliance and this would be against India's interests. Now this goes back to the idea that India and China have unresolved border problems. They've had several times where shots have been fired across the border. And now if India depends on Russia and Russia allies with China, then India's ability to contend with China will be weakened. Well, what if the other potential happens? What if Russia, India, and China form an alliance to break from the blackmail policies of the Western bankers? Well, then who's got the problem? Not India. The problem is London and Wall Street. What we're really looking at here is geopolitics, the idea that you need to be in a bloc or you're not protected. This is the traditional British power game. Now, it's not working. The African majority, that is more than well over half the nations of Africa, did not side with the United States, the UK, and the European Union in the recent UN sanctions vote against Russia. In fact, nearly 2/3 of them abstained or voted against. The African Union, which had condemned the Russian attack on Ukraine, nevertheless refused to support sanctions against Russia. And Kenya rejected an offer from Zelensky to address their parliament. They said they did not want to appear to be taking sides. Well, let's say this again. If Ukraine wants to end the war, all they have to do is agree no to NATO, no to NATO weapons on Ukrainian soil, and pull the troops out of Donbass, where they have killed more than 14,000 people, the majority of which are ethnic Russian civilians. And that would be the starting point to end the war. Ukraine won't do that because the Western parasites are using Ukraine against Russia, and more importantly, against the Russia-China alliance and its potential, if push comes to shove, to replace the petrodollar system with a hard money, trade-driven series of financial agreements. That's the existential threat to the West. Now, as this economic crisis deepens, we see how perilous this is for the West. Sri Lanka announced yesterday a default on its foreign debt. That's $51 billion. And they said they need to keep the reserves to pay for fuel and medical imports. Nepal is another country that may be headed toward default. But the IMF and the World Bank have identified close to 50 nations on the verge of default, including Ukraine. Now, then we look at another aspect, the effect of the sanctions against Russia on Western nations. And we have this from the head of technology of Bosch, a German firm. Bosch, by the way, is the world's largest supplier of components to the auto industry. And the head of their technology sector said that if Germany halts imports of Russian gas, there will be highly relevant elements of the supply chain which will break down. So who's suffering? Is this causing Russia to change policies, or is it penalizing those allies of the United States and the United Kingdom for going along with their crazy idea of support for Ukraine freedom, which is nothing, as we've said, but a front for destroying Russia? Then look at the U.S. The inflation figures now are 8.5% for the year March of 2021 to March 2022, up from 7.9% for February. These are grossly understated. If you've been shopping recently, you know that your food prices are much more than 8.5% up from last year. The same people who previously told us that we were facing transitory inflation are now saying inflation has peaked. Would you buy a used car from them? Well, you probably can't, because the price of used cars have gone up close to 200%. Then we have the real reason for this inflation exposed by the latest figures released by the Federal Reserve, which have not been reported to you by the mainstream media. These are the borrowing by the JP Morgan Chase in the first quarter of 2020. The JP Morgan was the largest recipient of emergency loans from the Fed through something called the Money Market Mutual Fund Liquidity Facility, the MMMFLF. Hardly an acronym you can remember. But this facility opened March 23rd, 2020. On the first day, JP Morgan's money market funds borrowed $8.97 billion. To cover what? Probably expected losses in the derivatives markets. Overall, JP Morgan Chase has been the largest recipient, or the next to the largest recipient, of the bailout loans through the repo market. In the fourth quarter of 2009 alone, 2.59 trillion went to JP Morgan. The first quarter of 2020, 3.6 trillion. And that borrowing is continuing. Why? Because they need the money to back up the worthless financial instruments that they're still trading using money from your accounts. And the day that the Fed stops this bailout process or cuts it back is the day your accounts plunge down towards zero. JP Morgan will be okay because they'll keep trading it and they'll keep getting Fed money to keep themselves solvent as a so-called systemically important financial institution, a sci-fi. But you're not a systemically important financial institution, and you'll be hit by it just as Sri Lanka was hit, just as the German auto industry has been hit by these parasites who are trying to divert attention from what they're trying to do with the Great Reset by launching a war against Russia. And it's not just that that's a diversionary action, it's a necessary action for them to degrade Russia, to stop the Russia-China alliance as an alternative to their Great Reset. The question is, how much longer will the rest of the world listen to the lies coming from the City of London and Wall Street that benefit the billionaires? I hope you're getting the message. And if you are, pass it on. We have to win this fight. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow.